When you can't find the record that you want on your ancestor for their birth, marriage, or death, well, where do you go next? In this episode, I'm going to cover substitutes for vital records that you can find around Pennsylvania. Hello, friends. This is Denise Allen. I am a researcher here in Pennsylvania, and I am going to help you discover your Pennsylvania ancestors through substitutes for vital records. Now, actually, these records are ones that most genealogists want on their ancestors anyway, even if they already have a birth certificate, death certificate, or marriage license for their ancestor. Why not get all the records that you can get on your ancestor? But when we can't get those records, when it's just too far back, or we're just having trouble locating birth certificates, death certificates, or marriage licenses, or maybe it's a registration for birth or death, or marriage registration back in the 19th century, well, these kinds of records are going to help you out. So I'm going to run through 10 different sets of records and where you're going to locate them in Pennsylvania. So grab a pencil, maybe get your thumbs ready to type on your phone, and let's go. All right, the first place I like to look when I want some additional records on my ancestors is cemetery records. Now, a lot of people are searching on Find a Grave or Billion Graves and looking for those cemetery records, but I'm going to tell you that that might not be the best place to locate information on your ancestors. I discovered a few years ago when I was busy fulfilling Find a Grave requests that there are people who put their ancestors on Find a Grave in cemetery plots, like not actual plots, obviously. This is just a profile on Find a Grave. And they say, hey, this person died and is buried in this cemetery. And then they ask for volunteers to go look for that person. But they don't have any proof that that person was buried there. They're just hoping that someone will go and look for them to figure out whether or not that person has a plot there. This method does not work because future researchers, not knowing that this other researcher made up information that a person's buried there, assume that that ancestor is in fact buried in that cemetery. So do not rely on Find a Grave. The profiles on there might not actually be related to who is actually buried in the cemetery. So, how do you figure out who's buried in a cemetery? Two methods. One is you can contact the local genealogical or historical society to find out what records they have on burials. There are volunteers that have gone through cemeteries and written down the names on every single tombstone along with the dates and their location in the cemetery. They have done this since the 1920s or earlier, and if a headstone has disappeared, well, it would still be recorded in their records. So that is one place to go. If you already know the cemetery, contact the cemetery itself. They have records on who's buried in their cemetery, hopefully, as well as who bought the plots in the cemetery. So those are two different sets of records. There's who bought the plots and there's who's buried in the plots. And you want the who's buried in the plots as much as who bought the plots because you're trying to find the information on your ancestors. That burial plot information often has when the person died, obviously, when they're buried, but also who their spouse was and when they were born. The information is also typically there. You also want to know who they're buried with and who they're buried alongside of, because it's probably family. The next thing I like to get for my ancestors, if I can locate it, is funeral home records. Now, funeral homes started, the oldest ones in Pennsylvania, in the late 1700s. The first one is recorded as Kirk and Nice in Plymouth Township in Montgomery County. But of course, there were also funeral homes in Philadelphia, where the wealthiest people lived in the state at that time. But funeral homes really weren't that popular until after the Civil War. So after the Civil War, during the Civil War, they practiced embalming. After the Civil War, embalming became a standard practice, and funeral homes spread across the state. Cremation started closer to the 1900s, and cremation started to become popular. Wasn't accepted in every religion, which is why not everybody did it. But those funeral home records, if you can locate them, if it's the right time period for your ancestor, would have a lot of details on the family and about the person that the burial is for. Funeral homes today in the 20th century are critical to filling out those death certificates and getting information from the family. That is often the place where the informant is doing the informing. It's to the funeral home director who is recording the information on the death certificate. So funeral home records, I definitely like to try to find. If the funeral home is still in existence, I will contact them directly. If it is not, I will look in the local historical society to see if the records have been deposited there and keep my fingers crossed and pray that those are there. Now, the third place to find information on the vital events of our ancestors is, of course, newspapers. We love using newspapers in genealogy. They are easy to access, easy to search, and fabulous. We can find out all kinds of things about our ancestors in newspapers, and I'm sure you have too. But did you know that not all newspapers have been digitized and put onto the internet? So, again, check with that local historical or genealogical society for newspapers that they might have on microfilm or still on newspaper that you can search for more information on your ancestors. And if you want a list of some additional Pennsylvania newspapers to search that are not on the major newspaper sites, newspapers.com, or the Library of Congress's Chronicling America, go to my website, paancestors.com, and type in the search bar newspapers, and you will find a collection of Pennsylvania newspapers that you can access for free from home that are digitized and searchable. Love the searchable part. The fourth thing that I like to try to find on my ancestors for birth, marriage, and death information is military pension records. Now, no, not every person served in the military, but if I have an ancestor that did, they might have talked about who their wife was, who their children were, because they wanted to make sure that their pension monies went to those family members. Military pensions for the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812 are on fold3.com, which is a subsidiary, which is part of ancestry.com. And for the later wars, those are still all on paper and are at the National Archives. But if you are an experienced Pennsylvania researcher and you listen to this episode about military records with Erin McWilliams from the Pennsylvania State Archive, you know that the Pennsylvania State Legislature also awarded Pennsylvania veterans compensation, and those files are at the Pennsylvania State Archive with that critical information that you want as a genealogist. Now, for record set number 5, this is also at the Pennsylvania State Archive, and one of my favorites, and that is institutional records. So if you had a person that was institutionalized in Pennsylvania, either in a prison or an asylum, I know it sounds kind of creepy to talk about this, but it is actually a really good thing in terms of genealogy research. The Pennsylvania State Archive has been collecting those records from the state prisons and the state asylums, many of which are now closed, and taken them in and started to organize them. In those records, you will find admission information on what they call the inmate for both types of institutions, and possibly a photograph. To access those records, you need to do a research by mail request to the Pennsylvania State Archive. Go to their website, pastatearchive.org, for more information and to get the form to make those requests. The sixth place you can find birth, death, and marriage information is, of course, the U.S. Census. It is our go-to place as genealogists. But did you know there was a mortality census in 1850, 1860, 1870, and 1880, and 1885 in some states and territories, but not Pennsylvania? So if you had an ancestor who died in the year prior to those censuses, you would find them in that special mortality census conducted by the U.S. Census Bureau. Those censuses have all been digitized and are complete for Pennsylvania on Ancestry.com, so you can go ahead and check those out. And you can hope that the census taker did not follow directions and just happened to write down your ancestor's name if they died 2 or 3 years prior. You never know with the census. So check out the mortality schedules. That's the formal name of them for some additional information on your ancestors. Now, the seventh record set, as long as I'm talking about death, I'll just move on to probate records. Probate is what happens when a person is deceased and their estate needs to be distributed to their heirs. A person can die with a will and have their estate distributed that way according to their wishes, or they can die intestate and have their estate go through the orphans court in Pennsylvania. Either way, one way that you'll find it in a county courthouse is under estate administration. A lot of counties have made specific indexes for that so that the two are combined in one place. So when you look for these, you want the entire probate packet, not just what's been digitized, maybe on Family Search or Ancestry. So contact the county courthouse to get the full packet, which would include all the steps of probate from the time that the person died to the time that they started administrating the estate to the time that they distributed the assets to the time that they actually closed the estate out. There's lots of steps. It takes a year or two to do an estate, and you would find that all at the county courthouse where your ancestor resided. Record set number 8, going to the beginning of a person's life, is church baptisms. Now, not every religion practiced baptism of infants, but when they did, those records are wonderful to figure out when a person was born and who their parents were. That is all noted in the church records. To figure out where you would find those church records, it's always great to look at a map of the time period where your ancestor lived, locate them on the map, and then see what churches were around them, particularly if you don't know what faith they were practicing at the time. Or maybe they just liked going to the prettiest church in town. You don't know. It's very confusing trying to figure out what motivated our ancestors. But those church records, a lot of genealogical societies have collected those over the years and indexed them, made copies of them, and they're a great resource to check, hey, where would these be? Record set number 9 is family Bibles. Now, maybe in your family, you've been fortunate enough that someone has passed down a family Bible where they recorded births, marriages, and deaths in the front of that Bible. But even if you are not that fortunate, those pages have often been photocopied and digitized, or at least photocopied and deposited at historical and genealogical societies around the state. The other place to look for them is with the Daughters of the American Revolution or the Sons of the American Revolution. If your ancestor went back that far, people would use that as proof of relationship while making applications to those lineage societies. Check out lineage societies for those Bible pages, and hopefully you will find one. And the 10th record set that I like to look at for evidence of birth, marriage, or death of my ancestors is business records or occupational records for them. So if I have an ancestor that worked on the railroad or was in the mines or working the steel mill, I want to see, is there any record of their time at that place that exists? And perhaps they had an accident at work and they would have made some notations about that. Hopefully they didn't die at work. That's always horrific. And there would be a file about that in those records. And in Pennsylvania, if your ancestors lived in the time when we had iron furnaces around the state, and this is from maybe 1780, about the time of the American Revolution, all the way up to about 1840, maybe a little bit later into the 1860s and 70s, we had these iron furnaces. They called them iron plantations at the time. And on those sites, they had a manager and a bookkeeper who would keep track of everything that happened with the men and the families that worked on those sites. So if someone needed off to get married or someone needed off for a death in the family, that was all recorded in these time books. Those time books are a little tricky to find. The two biggest collections I've run across are at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania and at Penn State University in their special collections on main campus. However, they're all on paper, they're not digitized at all, they're not indexed. So you as a researcher would need to know which furnace your ancestor worked at and then take the day, maybe 2 days, to actually page through those books and make notations of all the times that your ancestor was recorded in there. So this kind of research is like incredibly detailed, but if you need to do it to just figure this stuff out as a family historian, then this is one place that you would go. Now, I have a special kind of record too that I want to cover that's really particular to Pennsylvania. but this record is so unique. I'm just going to make a whole different video about it. So if you want to catch that one, make sure to hit subscribe. You're going to want to see it. It's very unusual. And I just always like to see that little subscribe number go up. It's very fun. It's encouraging to me putting out this content to you about Pennsylvania. So my name's Denise Allen. And if you have any questions about any of the record sets that I just mentioned, drop it in the comments below. And of course, you can find me over at PAancestors.com. And I wish you many discoveries of your Pennsylvania ancestors.